The woman in the gray cashmere coat was about to fall, and Mason Hale knew two things before anyone else on that train did. She was trying not to panic, and she was going to pretend she wasn't. The midnight train from New York to Boston gave one hard jolt just outside Providence, enough to rattle coffee lids, laptop bags, and the polished calm of everyone riding in first class. Mason had been half reading a stack of hospital paperwork under the dim overhead light, his fingers still stained with old paper dust from the archive room at the public library, when the brakes grabbed the tracks and sent the woman across the aisle straight into his lap. Gasps popped up around them, small and embarrassed, the kind rich people make when something messy interrupts a quiet ride. But the woman didn't apologize. She froze. Her hand clutched the front of his coat. Her breathing turned sharp and silent. Mason looked up and recognized that look immediately. Not anger. Not humiliation. Collapse. So instead of pushing her off or saying it was okay, he lowered his voice and said, "You don't have to stay upright for anyone right now." That did it. Her whole body trembled once, like she had been holding herself together with one thin thread, and that sentence had finally cut it. Mason shifted one arm behind her shoulders, steady but careful, while the train car watched in stunned silence. He didn't know her name yet, but he knew the type everyone else saw. Expensive watch. Perfect posture. A face trained never to ask for help. The kind of woman who probably ran a boardroom before breakfast and scared grown men with one look. What they couldn't see was what Mason could feel in the way her fingers tightened against his sleeve. She was exhausted clear through the bone. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down and saw the hospital reminder he'd set for Ruby's morning scan, 7:40 a.m., pediatric audiology, Boston Children's. He swallowed hard. Across the aisle, the woman finally lifted her head, blue eyes glassy with fury at herself more than anything else. "I'm fine," she whispered. Mason gave the smallest nod, because men like him learned a long time ago not to argue with people who needed dignity more than comfort. But when she pulled back, straightened her coat, and every passenger in the car started pretending they hadn't seen a thing, he caught one more detail that made him sit a little stiller. On the screen of the phone in her hand was a business headline with her photo under it. Naomi Whitmore, CEO. And somehow, for one impossible second on a rain-black train speeding toward Boston, the most untouchable woman in the state had fallen apart in the lap of a single dad nobody would remember by morning. Naomi Whitmore stepped off the train in Boston like nothing had happened, and that was the first thing that told Mason she was exactly the kind of woman people mistook for unbreakable. By the time the platform doors opened, her face was composed again, her coat buttoned, her spine straight, every inch of her back saying the moment on the train was over and would never be spoken of. Mason would have let it in there too. Men like him did not chase trouble, especially not the kind that wore 4-inch heels and had her own article in the business section. He adjusted the strap of his worn canvas bag, tucked Ruby's hospital folder under his arm, and moved with the early morning crowd towards South Station. Then his phone rang. "Hey, Rue," he said at once, his voice changing in a way he never noticed anymore. Softer, steadier, warmer. Ruby's face filled the screen, pale against a hospital pillow, her blonde hair twisted up on one side from sleep. "Did you get here yet?" she asked. "Almost," Mason said. "You eat anything besides that sad little applesauce cup?" Ruby narrowed her eyes. "Did you?" He smiled despite himself. "I am a grown man. I can have coffee for breakfast if I want." "That means no," she said. Behind him, heels slowed. Naomi had stopped a few feet away, just long enough to hear the exchange. Mason did not look up. He was too busy watching Ruby carefully, catching the tiny pause before she answered, the way she touched the edge of the temporary hearing device near her ear when she was nervous. "The nurse said they might run another sound test before the scan," she said. "I know," Mason told her. "One step at a time. I will be there before they start." Ruby glanced off-screen, then back at him. "Who was the lady?" Mason blinked. "What lady?" "The one whose sleeve was on your coat." He exhaled through his nose. Even through a phone, that child missed nothing. Just somebody who lost her balance. Ruby looked unconvinced. She looked tired. Mason finally lifted his eyes, and Naomi was still there, standing beside a column with her phone in one hand, frozen by the simple cruelty of being described accurately by a little girl she had never met. For one second, The huge station around them felt strangely quiet. Then Naomi stepped forward and held out something folded in her hand. Mason recognized it at once. Ruby's knit blue glove. It must have slipped from his bag on the train. Your daughter might need this, Naomi said. Her voice was even, but not cold now. Ruby leaned closer to the camera. Hi, she said brightly. Naomi hesitated, then gave the smallest wave. Mason took the glove. Thank you. That should have been all. But Naomi's gaze dropped to the hospital folder under his arm, then to the appointment sticker half peeling from the corner. Pediatric audiology. She looked back at him differently after that, as if the quiet man in the old coat no longer fit inside the easy category she had assigned him on site. By the time Mason reached Boston Children's, the sky outside had turned the color of wet concrete, and the city looked like it had not fully decided whether it was morning yet. He moved through the hospital the way he moved through every hard place in his life, quietly, without wasting motion. Check in. Confirm the scan. Ask about the sound test. Make Ruby smile before the nurses wheeled in anything with blinking lights. She was sitting up in bed when he stepped into the room, wearing oversized headphones around her neck and a sweatshirt that said Cape Cod in faded navy letters. You brought coffee breath into a pediatric ward, she said. Mason set her glove beside her and kissed the top of her head. That is how you know I love you. Ruby reached for the glove, then paused. The lady gave that back? Yes. Did she still look sad? Mason pulled the chair closer to the bed. Ruby, that is not a no. He almost laughed, but the door opened before he could answer. A technician stepped in with a rolling cart and explained the next hearing assessment in calm, practiced language. Ruby nodded like a soldier. Mason watched every detail anyway, the settings on the tablet, the placement of the equipment, the volume controls. He had been watching rooms like this for years. Not nervously. Precisely. Ruby noticed, because of course she did. Dad? She said softly after the technician stepped out again. You do that thing with your eyes when you already know what is wrong. Mason looked at her for a second too long. Nothing is wrong. Ruby tilted her head. That is also not a no. Before he could answer, his own phone lit up with an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something in him said not to. Mr. Hale, a woman said when he answered. This is Naomi Whitmore. I realize this is unusual, but I believe I may owe you more than a thank you. Mason went still. Across the room, Ruby's eyes widened with immediate interest. Naomi continued before he could stop her. A car is coming to the hospital with breakfast for your daughter. It is not a favor. It is an apology for this morning. Mason's jaw tightened. You do not owe my daughter anything. No, Naomi said, and for the first time since he met her, her voice sounded almost tired enough to be honest. But I owe the man who recognized a panic attack faster than my own security team ever has. Mason looked through the window into the gray hallway outside Ruby's room. You should not be calling me. Probably not, Naomi said. But now I need to know how a library archivist knew exactly what to say when I could not breathe. Ruby mouthed, Who is it? And Mason turned away from her bed before answering, because he already understood something he did not like. Naomi Whitmore was not calling to be kind. She was calling because she had started to notice the part of him he had spent years making invisible. Naomi did not send pastries from some polished bakery with tissue paper and a handwritten card. She sent plain eggs, dry toast, sliced fruit, and a cup of oatmeal with brown sugar on the side. The kind of breakfast ordered by someone who either paid close attention or had asked a very sharp assistant the right questions. Ruby stared at the tray when it arrived, then looked at Mason with the slow smile of a girl who knew life had just become more interesting. She is rich, Ruby said. Mason set the lid back on the oatmeal. Eat before you start profiling strangers. Ruby picked up a strawberry. You already profiled her. That is different. Because you are right. Mason gave her a look that would have worked on most children. It did not work on Ruby. By noon, the scan was over. The specialist had used careful words that still landed hard, and Mason was carrying a folder thick with options, costs, and timelines he would study down to the last line later that night. Ruby needed more testing. Maybe a new intervention. Maybe not. Nothing was certain, which in Mason's experience was always the most expensive kind of answer. He was helping Ruby into her cardigan when there was a soft knock on the open door. Naomi stood there in the same gray coat, though now it was draped over one arm, and her white blouse had lost the battle against a long day. She looked less like a headline and more like a person who had forgotten breakfast, lunch, and maybe how to sit down. Ruby noticed first. "You do still look sad," she said. Mason closed his eyes for half a second. Naomi, to her credit, did not flinch. "That is a very direct thing to say." Ruby shrugged. "I am in a hospital. People get direct in here." Naomi stepped inside, then held up a small paper bag. "I brought the gloves, partner. It was under my seat." Mason stared at the matching knit glove for a beat too long. He had checked for it twice. Naomi saw that. Of course she did. "And," she added, glancing at the folder in his hand, "I was already in the building for a donor meeting." Mason almost believed her until Ruby asked, "Is that why your shoes are wet like you ran here?" A silence followed that would have been funny if it did not reveal too much. Naomi looked down at the floor, then back at Ruby. "No," she said. "I came because I kept thinking about what your father said on the train, and because I do not like not understanding things." Mason's expression did not change, but something in the room did. Naomi was not here to be rescued anymore. She was here to test the shape of the man who had seen through her in under 10 seconds. Ruby leaned back against her pillow and studied them both with open curiosity. Then she asked the question neither adult wanted first. "So which one of you is pretending harder?" For the first time since Mason had met Naomi Whitmore, she looked like a woman who had walked into a room without a script. Ruby's question hung there, bright and merciless, while the hospital monitor hummed softly beside the bed. Naomi let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Your daughter is dangerous," she said. "She gets that from her father," Ruby replied before Mason could speak. Mason rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. "Ruby, I am just helping," she said, then pointed at Naomi. "You first." Naomi looked at Mason, then at the rain-streaked window beyond the bed. "Fine," she said. "I pretend I am never tired, never scared, and never wrong. It is a very expensive habit." Ruby nodded like she had expected exactly that. Then she turned to her father. Mason stayed quiet long enough for Naomi to notice something she had only sensed before. His silence was not emptiness. It was selection. He chose words the way some people chose where to place their feet on thin ice. "I pretend simple things are simple," he said at last. Ruby frowned. "That is not a real answer. It is the only one you are getting right now." Naomi should have let it go. Instead, she stepped closer to the bed and placed the paper bag on the side table. "Your father knows more about medical sound equipment than most people in my product division," she said, her voice calm but sharp underneath. He watched one setup from across the room and tracked the technician's adjustments like he had done it himself. Mason's face did not change, but Ruby noticed anyway. "Dad," she asked softly, "what did you do before the library?" Naomi caught the wording at once. Not "what do you do?" What did you do? Even Ruby knew the man in the worn coat had not always belonged to old books and city paychecks. Mason looked down at the scanned folder in his hand, thumb resting along the edge like he needed the paper to anchor him. "A long time ago," he said, "I worked around systems that were supposed to help people hear better in bad conditions." Naomi's eye sharpened. "Bad conditions," she repeated. "That is a carefully chosen phrase. Most useful ones are." Ruby sat forward, blanket slipping from one shoulder. "Did you stop because of me?" The room went still. Mason looked at her then, really looked, and Naomi saw the answer before he spoke. Not guilt exactly. Something older. He moved to fix Ruby's blanket, buying himself 2 seconds that were too quiet to be accidental. "I stopped," he said, "because some jobs follow you home even after you leave them." Ruby absorbed that with the solemn face children get when they are trying to act older than they are. Naomi watched him, and the more careful he became, the less believable his ordinary life seemed. Then her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, and a product deck from her company opened by mistake where a technical mock-up had been left on screen. Mason's gaze flicked to it for less than a second, but in that second his whole body changed, just slightly, like a locked room inside him had heard its old key turn. Naomi did not know she had turned the screen toward him until Mason's expression changed. It was small, almost nothing, just a pause in his breathing and a stillness that did not belong to an ordinary library archivist standing beside a hospital bed. On her phone was a product simulation from Whitmore Systems, a sleek demo for a pediatric audio platform her board was preparing to fast-track through a new acquisition. To anyone else it looked clean, impressive, expensive. To Mason, it looked wrong. He stepped closer before he could stop himself, eyes fixed on the waveform display. Who signed off on that compression model? He asked. Naomi lowered the phone slowly. You tell me. Mason did not answer right away. Ruby watched both of them with the alert silence of a child who knew the adults had just walked into the real part of the story. Mason pointed at the screen. If the environment spikes, that filter will overcorrect. An adult can recover from that. A kid in active auditory rehab might not. Naomi's face hardened, not because she thought he was lying, but because he had spoken with the kind of certainty that left no room for polite dismissal. That model came from a company we are about to acquire. She said, it has been tested. Mason gave one short nod. Tested is not the same as safe. The words landed harder than Naomi expected. She had heard versions of concern before. Lawyers offered concern. Engineers offered concern. Risk teams offered concern in 12 slide decks with neat recommendations at the bottom. But Mason did not sound theoretical. He sounded like a man hearing an old alarm in a new room. Ruby looked from the phone to her father. Dad? She asked quietly. Have you seen this before? Mason's jaw tightened. Something too close to it. Naomi slipped the phone into her coat pocket, but not before noticing one more thing. His hand had curled slightly at his side, not in fear, but restraint. He was holding back. From the hall came the squeak of a cart wheel, a nurse's laugh, the ordinary sounds of a place where private disasters had to coexist with lunch deliveries and shift changes. Inside the room, the air felt different now. Naomi straightened. There is a donor presentation tomorrow at the Children's Innovation Fund, she said. That platform will be featured. Mason looked at her sharply. Do not put children near a live demo if that is the final configuration. Naomi should have pushed back. She should have asked for data, documentation, proof. Instead, she heard herself ask, how do you know? Mason met her eyes then, and the answer in them was not pride. It was refusal. Because I know what happens when people in nice clothes trust a clean prototype more than a messy truth. Ruby pulled her blanket higher and whispered the one thing neither of them wanted to hear. If he is right, are you still going to do it? Naomi did not answer. That silence told Mason enough. He picked up Ruby's skin folder, slid the papers into place, and stepped back into the version of himself he had spent years building. Quiet, careful, small enough to overlook. Then listen to me now, he said. Whatever room you are walking into tomorrow, do not let them use a child to prove a machine is ready. Naomi Whitmore had built an empire by never hesitating in public. So the next morning, she stood in front of the Children's Innovation Fund boardroom in a navy suit, a glass wall behind her, and told herself Mason Hale was just a man with old fear and sharp instincts. Nothing more. The investors wanted confidence. The hospital donors wanted hope. Her board wanted the acquisition announced before noon. And still, as the product team loaded the pediatric audio demo onto the screen, she kept hearing his voice from Ruby's room. Do not let them use a child to prove a machine is ready. Her chief technology officer, Brent Mercer, moved beside her with the easy smile of a man who had never paid for being wrong. You look tense, he said quietly. We have run the numbers 6 different ways. Naomi kept her eyes on the stage. Numbers are not children. Brent gave a small laugh, like she had made a sentimental joke. The room began to fill. Physicians, donors, journalists, parents from the hospital foundation. At the back of the room, near a table set with coffee and bottled water, Naomi saw a familiar figure in a worn dark coat. Mason. He had not dressed up. He had not tried to belong. He was there because Ruby had insisted on attending the donor breakfast after her scan, and because Mason was the kind of father who never let his child walk into a hard room alone. Ruby sat beside him, small and bright in a yellow cardigan, swinging one foot under her chair, her temporary hearing device catching the light. When Naomi saw her, something tightened in her chest. This was exactly what Mason had warned her about. Brent followed her gaze and smiled wider. Perfect, he said. A real pediatric patient in the audience. Humanizes everything. Naomi turned to him so fast he blinked. She is not part of the presentation. Brent lifted both hands. Of course not. But he said it too smoothly. Too quickly. On stage, the lead engineer began describing signal clarity, adaptive filtering, breakthrough responsiveness. Clean words. Beautiful slides. The kind of language that made danger sound like innovation. Naomi listened, but not with the same ears she had yesterday. She noticed what was missing. No long-range instability data. No open discussion of variable recovery thresholds in children. No mention of acoustic rebound in rehab cases. Across the room, Mason had gone completely still, his eyes fixed not on the presenter, but on the waveform monitor in the corner display. Naomi knew that stillness now. It was not doubt. It was recognition. Then Ruby leaned toward her father and said, something too soft for Naomi to hear. Mason answered without looking away from the screen. Ruby's face changed. Not scared. Serious. Like a child who had just been told to be ready. And for the first time in years, Naomi Whitmore walked into a room full of people waiting for her decision and realized the most dangerous person there might be the one smiling beside her, not the quiet single dad no one had taken seriously until now. Naomi should have stopped the presentation the moment Brent smiled at Ruby. Instead, years of training held her in place for 3 dangerous seconds, and 3 seconds was long enough for a polished disaster to start moving under bright lights. The engineer on stage invited the audience to watch a real-time responsiveness sequence, nothing invasive, just a gentle live environment simulation meant to show how naturally the platform adapted to pediatric hearing needs. Naomi felt her stomach drop before anything even happened, because now she could see it. The missing data, the rushed framing, the way Brent had positioned the room so optimism would outrun caution. At the back, Mason was already on his feet. Not dramatic, not loud, just standing, like a man whose body had recognized a threat before anyone else's mind caught up. Ruby looked up at him, trusting him completely, and that did something sharp to Naomi's chest. On the large display, the waveform shifted, then shifted again. Too fast. The presenter kept smiling, still talking about adaptive calibration, but Naomi saw Mason move through the aisle with that same terrible calm he had on the train. Turn it off, he said, not shouted, just clear enough to cut through the room. A few people turned. Brent did not. We are in the middle of a controlled demonstration, Brent said, with the easy annoyance of a man correcting someone beneath him. Mason did not even look at him. His eyes were on the monitor, on the side speaker, the edge of her hearing device, and blinked, her expression turning uncertain. Beside her, another child winced and pressed both hands over his ears even though the room was not loud to anyone else. Mason reached Ruby first, crouching to her level, his hand steady on the back of her chair. Look at me, he said. Not the screen. Me. Naomi was already moving before she realized it, crossing the room in heels that suddenly felt useless, every polished instinct in her life cracking open under one brutal fact. Mason had warned her. He had looked her in the face and warned her. Brent stepped toward the stage controls at last, still trying to manage optics, and Naomi turned on him with a voice so cold the nearest donors went silent. Shut it down, she said. Now. The monitor flickered. The room stilled. And in that raw, breathless pause after the system went dark, Naomi looked at Mason kneeling beside Ruby, calm in the center of the mess she had allowed, and understood the part that would cost her the most. The quiet single dad she had underestimated was not reacting like a worried father alone. He was reacting like a man who had lived through this before. The room never fully recovered after the screens went dark. Donors whispered. The engineer stared at the floor. Brent was already moving toward Naomi with that smooth corporate urgency men used when they wanted to contain truth before it learned how to speak. But Naomi did not look at him. She was looking at Mason, still crouched beside Ruby, one hand steady on the chair, the other resting lightly near her shoulder like he could anchor a whole room without raising his voice. Ruby blinked twice, then looked up at him and said, very softly, "You knew." Mason did not answer right away. He just held her gaze and gave one small nod, the kind a father gives when the truth is too heavy to decorate. Naomi felt something inside her shift, not because she had finally caught him in a secret, but because she had just watched the quietest man in the room become the center of it without asking for power, credit, or rescue. Brent reached her side and lowered his voice. We can still control this, he said. A technical glitch, a pause and rollout, a private review. Do not make this bigger than it is. That was the moment Naomi understood exactly what kind of man he was. Not reckless. Worse. Efficient with other people's risk. She turned to him slowly. You used a children's room to sell confidence, she said. Brent kept his expression level. I used a live environment to reassure investors. Mason finally stood, Ruby's hand still in his. That is how it starts, he said, his voice flat with something old and exhausted. Naomi looked at him. Starts how? For the first time since she met him, Mason did not step back from the question. He looked at the dead monitor, then at the sealed product file still open on Naomi's tablet, and something in his face told her this was no ordinary memory. With one room full of important people deciding a clean demonstration matters more than the children in it. Ruby's fingers tightened around his. Naomi heard the line for what it really was. Not a guess, not a metaphor, a memory. And before she could ask the next question, one of the hospital legal staff hurried in and whispered something that drained the color from her assistant's face. There was an archived report tied to the acquired company. Sealed. Restricted. Flagged years ago after a previous field failure no one on the current board had disclosed. Naomi looked back at Mason. He did not look surprised. He looked tired in the way people only look when a buried life has started breathing again. Ruby turned her face from one adult to the other, then asked the question that settled over the whole room like weather. If he warned you and you still did it, does saying sorry even count? No one answered her. Not Brent. Not Naomi. Not even Mason. Because the harder question was already forming underneath it. If telling the truth about what happened next would drag Mason's past into the light and put Ruby back inside the very world he had spent years protecting her from, should Naomi expose everything anyway, or should she protect the child and let the system survive one more lie?